Welcome to Arena Radio, the battlefield of ideas. My name is Chris Pilie with lanternsofliberty.us and thebattlefieldofideas.com. Wanted to thank you for joining me here today. Doing something a little different. I actually started a Google Hangout, and we're live now. And I'm also recording my normal podcast on my PC. So there is a little bit things going differently here. So if there's a hiccup in the broadcast, it is something that's unexpected. I've kind of worked out all the bugs on the podcast, and typically what I do is I run my video and audio. Actually, I run my video on my PC, and I run all my audio through my Apple. So I'm running some video on both, and sometimes I get a little lag on my PC. So if I go through any little hiccups here, just bear with me. So what I wanted to talk about today is something that I've been seeing kind of trending, I guess, if you will, on our Lanterns of Liberty Battlefield of Ideas Facebook forum. And, you know, a lot of good discussion going on about the corporate world, the state of, the United States economy. What is our system, our economic system in the United States? And a lot of what I've been seeing is going back and forth, mostly libertarians and conservatives going back and forth on corporations. And not all of the comments from libertarians or conservatives are the same. Some of them are, are different there. So I don't want to kind of put a staple on either one of those two groups of people, because I think that it's wouldn't be constructive. But the purpose of what I wanted to do here is I wanted to kind of expand on that. I wanted to give you my thoughts on it and explain the United States economy and that system, and also talk about the difference between free enterprise and corporatism. So, one of the things that, if you look onto the mass media right now, which you'll see, and I say right now, it's probably been over the last couple of years I've been watching this discussion about the growing income gap. There is a growing income gap. I know conservatives they like to either ignore it or kind of hopscotch around it, because it tends to be a talking point that is around anti-corporations or anti-big business, and actually the left has some good reasons for that. Libertarians, I think, often notice this growing income gap issue and address it pretty well. I think conservatives have a lot to learn there. And I had actually addressed this back on October 23rd of 2013, when the discussion really got into play. And I kept having to address it on Facebook posts and in forums, and I was collecting a lot of information to prove my point, and I finally had enough, and I said, I need to put this information in a post. And every time I get confronted with some kind of growing income gap discussion, I bring this post up. So if you have seen this post before, it's because there's a ton of evidence there to prove the point that I'm about to make. And I'm going to go through it here if you haven't read it. If you want to follow along on it, you can go to lanternsofliberty.us and just click the Lanterns link up top, and you'll see a list of posts there. And I think it's on the second page. You'll have to scroll over to the right, the second page, and it's called the America's Growing Income Gap. Before I get into this particular post, I do want to address something here, because I think it's really important, because I'm going to mention the right and the left. And right now, there's a trend on our forum right now where I'm seeing this diamond-shaped diagram to somehow describe our ideologies, which I don't want to get into the weeds in that, but conservatism is really not an ideology. It can be accompanied with an ideology, like Catholicism or Christianity or something like that, which I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but conservatism is basically following the Constitution. And a lot of people that follow the Constitution may not be conservatives. But the point of this diamond-shaped diagram, I think it's a pretty good one because it does shed some light on the fact that ideologies are not linear. But in looking at that and trying to look at America's system in that same light, I think it casts it's not correct. It really isn't correct in the American system. And let me explain. The diagram shows the left and the right on the outside, on each side of the triangle, the libertarian section, and then below, I even forgot what's on the bottom. I think it's authoritarianism or something like that. But that dialectic is incorrect in the United States. The left on this particular diagram is a more, at least at the extreme, would be, say, communism. And the right wing, or the right side of that, the most extreme, would be fascism. Well, that is a European model. You go to Europe, the right wing is a fascist, corporatist type model. In the left is a more communist, and I'm talking about the extremes, a more communistic type model. And then on the top of this diagram is libertarian. In the United States, we don't have that. And the reason why we don't have that left and right dialectic is because our country, our government, our federal government is structured on top of a constitution that lists negative liberties to the government. In other words, it tells the government what the government can't do to the people. If you look at all the amendments, they tell the government what they can't. It doesn't say what it can do to the people. It says what it can't do to the people. Okay? There's no other government in the world that has a system like that. So in looking at a system where the government can do things to people, the government can either decide to go in a corporate direction or a more communistic type of shared property type of system. In the United States, it's extreme liberty, which at the far end of the right would be anarchy, and the far end of the left would be fascism. And the reason why fascism is there is because it skips over communism, because communism, like anarchism, are two unachievable utopian ideals. You can't ever achieve communism, because in order to have communism, you have to have a elite set of people, a group of masterminds that are angelic. They're not at fault. They're not corrupt, which is impossible. We know that for a fact. And then in an anarchistic system, you have to have a whole populace of people. If it were to work, you have to have a whole populace of people of angelic character. And it's impossible as well. So that's why those two are utopian. But once again, the left and the right in the United States is different than that model we've seen. It's a neat model, but it really doesn't explain. Okay, now where I can give credence to that diagram is that our system is shifting to a more European model. So there is some credence there. We can say there is a right-wing fascistic, European-type fascistic group of politicians on the Republican side, even on the left, or I shouldn't say the left, the Democratic side, that are corporatists, okay? But I don't want to look at it like that because it really isn't the way it is. A corporatist in the United States is more fascistic. It's still left-wing. National Socialism, it's all left-wing. So in understanding left and right, when I'm talking left and right, I'm talking about libertarians on the far right, or actually anarchists on the very far right, then libertarians, conservatives going towards the left, and on the very far left, you're going to have your more people that are, desire communism or at the most extreme fascism. So this income gap, where does the income gap come from? Well, we do have an income gap, and that gap is getting wider and wider. And the reason why it is getting wider and wider is because of the government getting bigger and bigger. Now, some people will say, well, no, that's not right. It's corporations are doing that. And the left in the United States will say that it's corporations. Corporations are a group of people that get together And it's usually one person or two people, maybe 5 people get together. They form a corporation and they hire people as they need them. The people they hire are a resource, and they set path on a certain direction to try to achieve something, and that what they're trying to achieve is a profit. And in order to get that profit, they do a number of different things. They have to compete with other corporations. Sometimes they'll get patents to try to protect their property, their intellectual property, in order to become profitable or maintain their profitability. And sometimes these corporations actually go to the federal government to try to get favors. And they'll do that through lobbying, which lobbying is protected under our First Amendment. The idea that a corporation is a person, I hear this all the time from the left. No, a corporation is not a person. A corporation is an entity. And that entity has people. And that group of people, that entity of people, have a common goal. So the owner of that company, or the owners of that company, have the right, under the First Amendment, as determined by the Supreme Court, have the ability to go and lobby Congress. Now this poses a problem, because as we talked earlier about a system of communism on the far left, the very far left, when you have a group of elite people that are not angelic, they act like they are, they campaign as they're angelic, and they've never had problems, or they're not corrupt, or I should just say they're not human beings. They say they're not human beings. Human beings are not angelic. So as our government gets bigger and bigger, what ends up happening is corporations are going to the government and saying, hey, you know, I got a light bulb that actually fit into your environmental policy pretty damn well. In fact, it saves X amount of energy. It's really, really good. Those other light bulbs that my competitor sells, man, they're really, really nasty for the environment because they expend a lot of energy. They use a lot of energy. And so what does a politician do that in their best efforts, or their best intentions, I should say? Well, they decide that I'm going to go talk to my other representatives about my lobbyist friend here, about his idea. And we need to ban this kind of light bulb because it's not good for the environment, and it fits in the model of our, you know, global warming, climate change efforts. And that's just one example. There's so many examples out there. But what happens in a European model is the corporation and the government work together, and then you have activists that work together with the government to push away the corporation. So you have this shifting, okay, from side to side of how it works. Now, in a constitutional system like ours, those shifts and moves are very, very slow because it takes forever to get through Congress. It's a lot of hurdles to jump through. But in a European system, when the corporation or let's say the government makes a regulation, the corporations actually lobby the government to make sure those regulations don't screw them. And what ends up happening is the politicians don't know how that industry works, so they go to the corporations, specifically the ones that are giving them money, and say, how do we regulate your refinery? Well, the Exxon guy says, well, you see, we have this carbon dioxide that comes out of our cat cracker unit, and it creates all this smoke. And what we've built is a scrubber. The scrubber scrubs all of the sulfur and scrubs all of the carbon, and just simply puts out water vapor, and that's how we get rid of our carbon dioxide and sulfur. So the politician goes, that sounds like a great idea. We'll mandate that. And our Exxon guy, who gives us $20 million a year, we'll go ahead and write that regulation in there. We won't hurt our buddies over here that are giving us money. But what happens? They go down the road to a small refinery and say, hey, you have to put a scrubber in your refinery now. And that's how that works. But what happens is as they do that, then government comes back and does it again. And you have this constant leveling of corporate regulation and government interference that actually grow the government exponentially. So the government never stops growing, and the corporations never stop growing. That's what creates that income gap. Because the big corporations, slowly but surely, are doing this purposefully. Because they'd rather spend $20 million on a new scrubber or an upgrade in their system than have to spend $50 million a year fighting their competition. So basically, they're willing to spend a little extra money as long as they can stay in the back pockets of the government officials. Now, people on the left will say, well, that's Exxon's fault. And the people on the right will say, that's politicians' fault. Well, at the end of the day, the power to make these type of laws is in the hands of representatives, the legislature. The legislature could very well tell Exxon, hey, Exxon, go screw yourself. We're going to go to an independent body that's going to determine this. Of course, we can get into the independent body corruption as much as you want. But at the end of the day, if they wanted to do this in a more balanced way, that's the way they would do it. They would go to an independent body, and they would determine what needs to be done. I personally don't believe that regulations should be put in place at all at the federal level in this way. I mean, the states already have their own environmental protection. But I don't want to get too much in the weeds in that. But that's where your growing income gap comes in. So how? First of all, where is the evidence, the actual evidence in this? On that post that I made, I showed two different models. We'll talk about the two different models. One model I use as an example is Barack Obama's model. And it's not just Barack Obama. It's his entire government. It's his agencies. It's his regulations, the things that he's over. So he's just the very, very pinnacle of all of those different substructures underneath him. All the EPA, the FDA, all these different groups. And not only that, but a lot of this has to do with the legislature, because the legislature controls spending. The other one that I modeled that is usually the favorite of conservatives, which I believe is a perfect example of a revived economy, is the recovery under Reagan. So I got those two in there. And it's very simple. If you look at government spending, when the government spends more money, that money is going to stay close to D.C. because all the people that they're going to turn that money over to, for the most part, have an office on K Street, big corporations. They try to stimulate the economy. When they stimulate the economy, that's another word for a payoff, in my opinion. A lot of the stimulus money, if you really went through back in Barack Obama's stimulus, you'll find a lot of corruption there. Solyndra was one of them. They got tons of money to create these solar panels. The solar panels happen to be outdated. So they wouldn't have been able to compete on the open market because they had an outdated product. And they actually failed because of that. And with that failure, they took all of the money that we gave them and lost it. Now, they wouldn't have been able to get that money, or if they would have got it, they would have held the risk, not the American people. So I have a chart on that post, which I'll actually show in the podcast, of the actual growing income gap. And what I think is really, really important is the biggest part of the income gap, or actually the place where the income gap really started to spread, was in the mid-90s. Now, we know that we had a massive recession, which was the housing market. A lot of people love to blame George Bush, and some people want to blame Barack Obama. Some people want to blame, all these different presidents. When in fact, the reason why the recession was here, actually that recession, a lot of it started in 2006, I think, or 2007. It's really when the market started to come down, the housing market. And then once it came down so far, everything else just came down with it. And that's when we saw the collapse in the market, all the banks, going dry, running out of money. But it started in the mid-90s, the housing collapse. Now, keep in mind that Americans, their biggest part of their wealth is usually in their home. The majority of Americans, their home is their biggest part of their wealth. That's their biggest asset. So when you have a housing market, that is the assets of the majority of Americans are in their homes. Sometimes they'll have equity in a home. They'll own half of the home. The bank will own the other half because they're still paying on it. So, and then you have the home values. You know, if you buy a house in 10 years, that house is going to be worth more money for the most part. That's the way it's worked for a long time. Well, what drives the housing prices to go up? Well, people wanting to buy houses. Well, the more people want to buy houses, the more value that homes, you know, start to acquire, and the value of those homes go up. So if you look at the market chart for the housing market over the course, I have a chart on the Lands of Liberty. But if you look at the housing chart, and then you look at the income cumulative growth per household, you'll see that the chart is almost identical. And the reason why is because, just as I said, home values are really the main aspect of a individual's or family's wealth. So in 1990, I think it was 96, Clinton, as well as Congress at the time, Congress put through a bill to allow Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which at the time was not a government-owned entity, that they were highly regulated and they had tons and tons of money, were allowed to get into the subprime market. Okay? And what happened is once they started selling subprime loans, if you have a corporation that is almost a monopoly, like Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, I always get the two. Is it Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae? I always get those two mixed up. Anyway, when you give them the ability to jump into subprime loans and not only allow them, but you push them to allow Americans in the subprime market, or people that are not ordinarily able to afford homes, you push them into that market, and you allow them to purchase homes which they wouldn't ordinarily be able to afford because of their credit and so forth. When you push that, you actually create a flood of new buyers into the home market. So what happens is that market starts to climb. The value of the home starts to climb, really not as a true part of the market, because you're tricking the market. You're saying, no, you ought to give them a home even though they can't afford one, or they don't have the credit to be able to get one. You ought to still get. So this flood of new buyers creates a bubble. So the bubble was created by subprime. Whenever you hear about the bubble, it wasn't created by offsets and all that stuff with the bankers and all that. It was created by buyers. There was more buyers with a limited amount of homes. It increased the value of homes drastically. If you were playing around in the market at the time, buying and flipping houses, you were probably making an ass load of money. And the reason why is because there was a flood of buyers to the market. So as this bubble started to grow, and the risk was there, it was obvious risk, the banks said, you know what? We got a lot of risk. We're being told that we have to sell these homes and give loans to people that they wouldn't ordinarily provide. But we're getting insured by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all these others. So we got some room there, but we got to do something with this risk. So what do banks do? It's not just banks. I mean, you do it yourself. You got insurance for risk. So banks, they actually do this as well. Now, what banks do is they create policies, much like an insurance policy. They create investment vehicles for people that want to make some money, because when you go invest in the market, you have a certain calculated amount of risk that you're willing to participate in. And if you make a successful decision, you make money. So they took these investment vehicles with all these risks, these bundled subprime loans, and they sold them to the market. And they distributed the risk across the market, all these different big banks. So you have all these buyers, buying all this stuff, and all that risk starts to spread across the market. Okay? And then once that occurred, then it got to the point of no return. It got to the point where people started defaulting on their homes. And the reason why it did was because of the rising gas prices in the middle of the 2000s, because of the wars going on over in the Middle East. If you don't remember, look it up. I think there was a huge spike up to almost, I think, $160 a barrel. And at that time is when all the people, think about it. if you double the price of fuel, for people that can barely afford to pay their loan, what happens to their gas prices? What happens to their electricity prices? What happens to the food? They ship food in trucks with fuel. So the prices of everything starts to go up. You get this inflation, and people start defaulting on their home loans. And this is what created the crash. The crash came because as people couldn't pay their home loans, they couldn't pay other things. They couldn't pay their bills to AT&T. They started shutting off their phones. They started shutting off their cable. They started doing all these different things. And then after that, the investors started to see the trends coming down. They started pulling money out the stocks. And that's when the market collapsed. So whenever I hear these anti-Bush guys say it was Bush, no, it wasn't Bush. If you want to blame Bush, the only thing you can blame is already had a war going on in the Middle East that possibly could have caused some friction that made gas prices go up. But that wasn't the problem. That was just what triggered the collapse, gas prices. Okay, so why am I getting into this? All right, so after the recession, there was this huge move because of a crisis that had developed, a huge move to address the crisis. Okay, now we've heard this many times before, but Rahm Emanuel said it beautifully. Never let a crisis go to waste. If you remember, at the time, that was an election era at the time. There was a president about to leave his position, and another president that was about to come in. And one president needed to pay off the people that he was leaving and that had helped him out. And another president was coming in and he needed to pay people that give him money. Well, guess what? They were the same people. In fact, if you look at the people that were in their administrations, most of them stayed over. Hank Paulson is a huge Goldman Sachs guy. And Goldman Sachs was given to both the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, Goldman Sachs was holding so much of this bad debt when the collapse came. Who did they bail out? Well, they bailed out all these other banks. Well, that took Goldman Sachs off the hook. Okay, so now you're throwing bad money at bad money. Our money. You're throwing that bad money at bad money. That is corporatism. That is not free enterprise. That is corporatism. And the bad part about it, if you look at the same time when they were giving all this money to these banks, you had like, I think, 100 some odd banks a year, major banks around the country failing every year. They could have given that money to other banks that didn't do that. I don't advocate that. I think they just let the whole market fall to where it's supposed to be. The reason why the market came down is because it came down to its true value. It might have actually went below it, but it came back up. If you remember, there was a rebound, small rebound. But it actually, if you look at the chart for the housing market, you have this huge bubble in values, and then it crashes, it comes back down, and it comes back on that long line, that trend. Okay. So the point I'm trying to get at here is that all the money started flowing out of the government in 2008. Started going to the stimulus stuff, almost $1 trillion in stimulus spending. You had the bailout of General Motors. You had the bailout of Chrysler. All this money flooding into the market. And not only that, but they had those new incentives they were going to put out there, new plans to revitalize the infrastructure of the United States. Well, all this money goes to campaign people. That's really what it happened. If you look at Caterpillar, look how much money Caterpillar got. And what does Caterpillar do? They supply equipment to people that build construction jobs. So if you give Caterpillar a bunch of money to go do construction jobs, the construction job's got to be there. If not, you got a bunch of equipment sitting there or a bunch of cash sitting in Caterpillar's bank. So that's dislocation. That's when you hear dislocation. That's what dislocation is, because the federal government can't even build a frickin' website for Obamacare. Do you think they can manage the entire infrastructure of the United States? No. They can kind of pinpoint some areas and throw some money at it and hope it works. But they can't manage it at that level. So there's another chart on the website with a chart that says total government spending as a share of GDP. And if you look at around the year 2000, actually one of the things that the Republican Congress as well as Clinton did well was in the 90s. They actually spent a lot less money than they normally spend. Well, once it hit the Bush era, and they started spending a ton of money. Some of that was because of the war. There was a lot of things. But if you look at around the 2005-2006 range, there was a huge spike from around the 31% range to almost 37%, actually almost 39% of GDP. He had a huge spike in spending. Okay? Now think about this. So you have all these government contracts out there, and you have to get money. You have to flood the market. That's your mindset. That's your mentality. You're a Keynesian, economist, and you're saying you need to flood the market with cash to try to get the economy moving. Well, what do? You have all these contracts with all these different businesses that already have infrastructures in place to hire people, and you're just trying to hire, regardless of what they're going to do and if it's actually going to be productive or not. You're just trying to flood these companies with money so they can hire people, and then they can try to kickstart the economy again. That was the idea. Well, who did they give it to? You think they give it to mom and pop over here in Louisiana, in Prairieville, on the corner? No. They give it to Lockheed Martin. They give it to Northrop Grumman. They give it to Boeing. They give it to General Dynamics Corporation, or Hewlett Packard, or Booz Allen Hamilton. That spy that's over in Russia right now used to work for. And that's who gets the money. Well, what happens when they get the money and the mom and pops don't? Okay, that's where the income gap starts to come in. So this idea of Keynesian economics, where you flood the market with, that creates an income gap. It creates an income gap. It destroys small businesses. Okay, because what happens with the big company that does have government contracts, like a General Motors or General Electric or somebody like that, and they wouldn't spend a bunch of money on buying Chevy Volts, which the General Motors loses money to make. But the government went and bought a bunch of them for people around the country. And what does that do? Well, it hurts the other small companies, that may make automobiles. Or how about instead of buying all brand new Volts, how about you fix a couple of the automobiles that you have and help out AutoZone, or maybe some of these smaller companies, the mom and pops around the country. So you create dislocation. You falsify the market, which creates a bubble. So we hear about the ups and downs in the free market system. Those ups and downs are created by market manipulations, like I'm talking about. So as the government grows, so does the wealth, the proper economic, true market wealth redistribution. I'm not talking about government wealth redistribution. I'm talking about the redistribution that we could never fathom to calculate in the market. The decisions that Americans make every day when they drove up to the drive-thru. That's what I'm talking about. And they sit there and they go, I think I'm going to get a number 2. Nah, I'm not going to get a number 2. I'm going to get a number 3 with, large fry with that. Those are the decisions that are made by Americans all over the country every single day. Billions and billions of them every minute. Those are the things that the American government can't ever figure out. They'll never be able to figure it out. But so whenever you look to a Lockheed Martin and say, hey, Lockheed Martin, here's $20 million of stimulus money, go ahead and create a new plane or whatever, and Lockheed Martin goes out and hires a bunch of people, a small business guy goes out of business, and he goes to work for Lockheed Martin because his business is sucking, right? So there's a guy that could be, he could be working on his own, building his own business, his own dream, but no, he's got to go work for Lockheed Martin now. So let's look at, I want to read some of these numbers because it'll blow your mind. And I'll read this right off the website post. It says if you notice from 2002, and it's talking about that GDP chart, from 2000 to 2002, there was a drastic increase in federal spending. Government contracts increased drastically after the September 11th attacks. Government contracts, for the most part, go to large corporations like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, SAAC, Booz Allen Hamilton, and others. Here is a list of the current contracts reported by Washington Technology. I have a link there if you want to go look. In 2012, to give perspective of the amount of government spending with mega corporations. All right, so all you liberals are going to love this. Some of you libertarians are going to love this, but here's some raw meat. Lockheed Martin Corporation gets $17 billion of funding from the federal government. Northrop Grumman gets $9 billion. Boeing gets $7 billion. SIAC gets almost $6 billion. Raytheon gets $5.6 billion. General Dynamics Corp is $5.4 billion. Hewlett Packard gets $4.1 billion. Booz Allen Hamilton gets $3.8 billion. This is all government money. This is, or I should say, your money. Okay, going to all these mega corporations. Why? Because they need Hewlett Packard computers to run in their government offices. They need planes to fly around the country on. Once they create a new department, Homeland Security, now they all need cars. Now they all need planes. Now they all need computers, right? And they need people to fix their computers. They need people at NSA with like Booz Allen Hamilton to run the NSA, because there's no politicians don't know crap about technology. You can tell right now by the IRS scandal. None of them have a clue about how a hard drive works. Computer Science Corporation. Science Corporation gets $3.5 billion. Dynacorp International gets $3.4 billion. You want me to keep going? There's, let's see, 101 of them I got listed on the page. I stopped at 101. The 101 is PAE, and they get $168 million. The money that the United States spends on corporations, that gives to corporations, and this is contract work. This is what spending we give to these corporations. Who do you think is getting that? Do you think that just the mom and pop gets it? No. These are people that lobbied the United States congressmen to facilitate their big government, their ever-growing government, with whatever they wanted to sell it to them. Hey, you got that computer right there. I can get you a really nice computer. I work for Hewlett Packard. Yeah, I think we can do that. Hey, by the way, I can send you a check for $2,000 this week towards your campaign. That's how that works. K Street. So there you go. There's the red meat for the liberals and the libertarians. Some of you libertarians out there, the left libertarians, whatever that means, but there's some of them that claim to be left libertarians. There it is. Lobbying spending. If you look on the site, I got a list or a chart that shows the lobbying spending. In 2000, it was $72 million in lobbying spending. That is just campaign funds, right? Or actual, not just campaign funds, but that's to generate, that's how much was claimed by these lobbying firms that they needed to spend in order to lobby. Okay, so it's not just money going to campaign people. In 2011, it was at $220 million, and that chart just keeps gradually going up and up and up. And why is that? Because the government is getting larger and larger and larger, and as the government gets larger and larger and larger, they take more and more of our money, and they need more infrastructure. They need more cars to drive. They need more tickets to events to take their cronies to. So when we conservatives say the big government is the problem, that's what we're talking about. We're not saying that corporations are not at fault. We're not saying that, we need to, love all our corporations, give GE a hug for us. That's not what it's about. It's about get the government smaller so they spend less of our money. Get control of the government. That doesn't even mention regulations. I'm not sure if I have regulations on here, the cost of regulation. I think I have it on another post. But it'd blow your mind to see how much money is spent on regulation. Okay, so at the same time, in 2000, when all the spending was going up, I got another chart on here it's a small business optimism index, which basically means they measure inventory of small businesses to determine whether or not a small business sees that they're going to be viable. There's a consumer price index, which looks at inventories across the country. This one is just simply looking at small businesses. If you look at their chart, from around 2004, 2005 range, when the housing collapse started to turn, or when the housing market started to turn, it dropped drastically. And guess what? It's barely even rebounded. Why? Because the antidote that I gave you earlier about the guy at a small business that was having trouble with his business, he saw the market was really hard to work in, and the money was tight. He couldn't get loans, So he went to a company that could get loans, that was getting money from the government to prop him up. That's the kind of stuff here that we're talking about. So big government is the cause of the wealth income gap, or the income gap itself. There's also, if you look at the Dow Industrial Average, and a lot of people, there was a liberal that came on the Lanterns post the other day, and he was like, "Yeah, look at the Dow, we're doing great." I'm like, knucklehead, do you know what the Dow is? The Dow is 30 companies. That's it. Out of all the millions of corporations and companies and small businesses around the world, around the world, it only takes into account 30 American.
I mean, there was nothing you could do.
Can you hear me now?
Jesse, what's the latest? You ask, I deliver. I just spotted Anthony. There we go. I got you. I did.
And all of a sudden, it's all about the oppression of Indians and how we push them off their land. So if you didn't get that, I'm not going to tell you. Check out Arena Radio. Welcome back to Arena Radio. My name is Chris Pilie with lanternsofliberty.us and the battlefieldofideas.com. We've been talking income inequality. And I think it's really important that we all discuss this in a, I would say, a more sterile or neutral environment. And stop with the Republican versus Democrat crap. The reason why we are in the position we are in today is because of that dialectic. And that dialectic has transgressed or transformed into a European argument, a fascist versus communist argument on the extremes. And for the most part, some of our politicians have become that. So they've become corporatists, or what you could call fascists. And we've got some of our politicians on the left that have become democratic socialists. Or arguably they're aligned with communism. So I wanted to just kind of do a little freestyle conversation here. I got Trey Roberts. He is one of my compadres that actually got this bug in me to do podcasts and video. And I wanted to welcome to the show. How you doing, Trey? You there, Trey?
Now I am.
How you doing, man? How's it going?
Going great, man. Glad to be here.
That's good. Trey, what are your thoughts on this dialectic, this this Republican versus Democrat dialectic that we're seeing getting ever so heated in discussion?
Well, to me, the other day on CNN, Don Lemon, far from the conservative, had on his show, and most of the time he always talks, or recently, and by recently over the past year or so, he talks primarily about race issues. And he had Morgan Freeman, the great actor, the great voice, on his show. And Don Lemon waded into waters that I don't think he really, in this particular issue, as it deals with like wealth distribution, the income gap, and race. And he asked Morgan Freeman if he felt that race played a part in wealth distribution. And Morgan Freeman's answer was, quote, "No, I don't." And he says, you, because Don Lemon is a black man, he says, you and I, he says, we're proof. Why would race have anything to do with it? He says, stick to it, put your mind to it, and put your mind to what you want to do, and go for it. And Freeman, before he said that, he clarified what Don Lemon meant. And he said, you mean today? And Don Lemon said, yeah. And I thought that Freeman's caveat of clearance, if you will, of saying, you mean today or you mean 80 years ago? And he's like, today, no. He said, you don't see anything. And I think you hit it on the head on the income gap. It is something that is created by government. However, I think, and I did yesterday on 800 AM here in New Orleans, I did a show. There was a great piece, if you can pick up the most recent issue of Imprimis. I don't know if you got a chance to see it or not. There's a guy who writes for the Manhattan Institute. He goes by the name of Theodore Dalrymple. Okay, but it's his pseudonym. His real name is Andrew Daniels. And I reached out to him. He lives in England. He couldn't come on the show yesterday because it was 9-hour difference and it was somewhat late notice, but we're going to have him on again. And he writes about this world view of the elite, the controlling elite, and the title of the article is The World View That Creates an Underclass.
Right.
And it was fascinating because he only talked about Great Britain and what's happened over the course of his life in Great Britain. He's an older gentleman. He's been a doctor. He actually spent 15 years crossing the continent of Africa by means of public transportation, giving medical care, and seeing the really third world poor. The kind of poor where you have nothing to eat. You got to walk 3 miles just to get a drink of water.
You crap in a hole in the ground.
And then he talked about when he came back to Great Britain, and he would go into the poor areas of Great Britain, one of the things he noticed was although, first of all, there was no male figure in the house, it became a negative question to ask the kids where your father was. Mm-hmm. The men that were in the homes that he visited, he said, were like transient characters. They were in and out of the life. It was the boyfriend of the moment, the drug fix of the moment, the financial hookup for the moment, for the rest of the families. That was one big thing. The second thing he realized was he said he began to notice that all these people had huge TVs. And although these people had no fathers, he said, make no doubt about it, their televisions were the fathers of these children. They sat in front of their television. He said he would do these in-house examinations, and these TVs, he said, would be big as cinema screens. It'd be loud. He said it never felt like it always felt like he was doing these in a theater. Did I lose you?
He's Jag on a traffic cam in Brickell. He's traveling alone. Good news is he's minding his red lights, going the speed limit. We should be able to catch up to him. He's heading south on 821.
821 south. Do you think he's going to Cutler Bay?
That would be my guess, yeah. With the explosion at the airport, all the flights in and out of Miami are grounded. He's probably trying to hop a load out of town.
Yeah, but there's got to be 50 marinas at Cutler alone. I mean, Hanson gets there, he's gone.
He's not making it to Cutler Bay.
Talk to my DIA contacts. Anson Fullerton is just a shrink who debriefs failed operatives and treats PTSD
Believe
cases.
me, he does a lot more than that, okay?
Jesse, I have a rogue agent on the loose, a burning plane on the tarmac, and the FAA breathing down my neck to release air traffic. I'm supposed to just forget all that and go after this guy?
Yeah. Look, I know how it sounds. We're running out of time. He's heading out of town. You gotta trust me on this.
All right, let's just say I did. What would you need exactly?
I can say we're trying to cut him off. As soon as they happen calling, we'll take whatever resources you got.
Jesse, in case you haven't noticed, I'm spread pretty thin.
Danny.
I'll do what I can, but for now, Michael's on his own.
The vehicle you want when hunting someone down depends on where you are in the chase. If you're behind your target, you need a set of wheels that's fast enough to catch up. If you're ahead and waiting for your target to come to you, you may want to think bigger.
Mike, the clock's ticking. I mean, I thought the idea was to get ahead of Anson so we can spot him from the road.
There are no